Benjamin Franklin was one of our country's most influential founding father, as well as a brilliant scientist and inventor. Though Franklin lived well over 2 centuries before the age of modern computing, one of his legendary quotes fits right into modern times and our topic today. The quote I'm referring to is, "By failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail." Who would disagree that first-rate planning and preparation is at the heart of any effective disaster recovery and business continuity strategy? Now, Ben Franklin seemed to understand the value of planning way back in his day. So today, there should be no problem, correct? Well, we all know that's far from true. Organizations are still falling behind the curve in some respects when it comes to their disaster recovery and business continuity preparation. In an effort to raise the bar, we'll present best practices that will help IT and business leaders stay ahead of that curve. After watching this report, viewers will be armed with fresh insights and be better prepared to face their next IT crisis or disaster, whenever that should occur. This program features expert Dave Lockhart. He is a senior consultant for the Tagan Point Consulting Group. Tagan Point, based in Washington Crossing, Pennsylvania, specializes in business transformation from strategy through execution. Lockhart has over 35 years of leadership experience directing and facilitating the design, development, and communication of business-aligned corporate IT strategy. There are several teaching points in this program. First, we'll discuss the state of disaster recovery and business continuity preparedness in enterprises today. Next, we'll talk about the typical shortfalls of DRBC plans. Then, we'll explore why more and more security experts today are viewing recovery and continuity plans as being codependent on each other. We'll then review the challenges organizations are facing with their DRBC plans and summarize what we've learned with several best practices. Finally, we'll wrap up with a look to the future and some further advice from our expert, Dave Lockhart. Now, let's begin our report. We'll discuss the state of disaster recovery and business continuity preparedness and learn about the typical shortfalls of DRBC plans found in organizations today. The importance of disaster recovery and business continuity planning and preparedness cannot be underestimated. Data provided by SingleHop, a leading cloud service provider, speaks to the need for maintaining effective DRBC plans and procedures. According to SingleHop, 93% of firms that lose their data center for 10 days go bankrupt within a year. 43% of enterprises that experience a disaster never reopen. And finally, only 6% of organizations without a DRBC plan will survive long term. With that information in mind, let's introduce our expert, Dave Lockhart, and learn more about the critical nature of effective disaster recovery and business continuity plans and procedures. Dave, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mike. It's my pleasure.
Well, Dave, it seems hard to believe that we're still hearing about the lack of disaster and continuity preparedness. I'd like to hear your perspective on the issue. Is this as big a problem as we are led to believe?
What's happened is the business landscape has changed dramatically. There's 2 factors that are really driving the challenge. One is the business landscape is changing. So you've got many companies that are driving business into emerging markets. They're trying to establish business in marketplaces where the infrastructure is not as stable. They're distributing their business functions throughout the world. And then you've got an IT environment which changed too. You've got cloud computing, you've got mobility, you've got IT organizations doing a lot of outsourcing. So what's happened is the challenge has gone from, well, I need to recover my data center in a certain amount of time, to now my IT applications, my business process, and my business is spread all over the place. So the challenge is greater now because of those 2 things. So I think what's happened is we've created a gap between what IT can do from a DR recovery perspective and what the business expects from a business functionality.
Well, give us a sense of the evolution of disaster recovery and business continuity planning over the past several years. What have the most significant changes been, considering the rise of cloud computing and the increasing number of threats and attacks on systems and data?
Well, what's happened is that most businesses within the business are building business continuity plans. So the business is looking, and business continuity by definition is location recovery. So the business says, I want to, if I don't have access to my corporate headquarters, or I don't have access to my manufacturing plant or my supply chain hub, what's my recovery plan for that? How do I restore operations in another location? You know, IT is looking at it from a DR perspective. They're looking at how quickly do I bring my servers and my storage up and running within a corporate data center. So the challenge is that the IT people who are doing DR planning and the business people who are doing business continuity planning are not talking about it together holistically, because it's the combination of the two things that makes everybody happy. If you've got a disaster and your business people don't have a place to work, then there's a problem. If you have a business continuity issue and the business restores business functionality in another location and the IT services aren't there to support it, there's a gap there also. So I think the challenge now is to bring those two functions together. They're codependent upon each other today, and think of the whole problem as being holistic and build a plan around the holistic approach to it.
And Dave, what have you found to be the typical shortfalls of DRBC plans today?
Well, I think that I think there's some best practices that are important to be successful. I mean, one best practice is to establish the IT and the business, the DR and the business continuity program as a corporate initiative, and get both business and IT executive sponsorship. So that's the first thing, is to establish it as a real program and to get sponsorship, leadership sponsorship, both from the IT and the business side. The second thing is to base business continuity recovery and DR recovery on business process recovery. Historically, people have based recovery on how quickly can I get SAP back up and running, or how quickly can I get my storage back online. The more meaningful thing to do, Mike, if you were the CFO of a company, is for me to have a conversation with you and say, how quickly do we need to recover invoicing? How quickly do we need to recover accounts payable? If you're running global supply chain, how quickly do we need to begin to send product again to our stores, as an example? So a best practice is to have the conversation for recovery, the recovery objective, to be based on business process and not on technical babble or something else. And so then by basing the conversation that way, what happens is that IT and the business can sit down at the table, and you can talk with a CFO, a supply chain leader, a laboratory leader, and you can have a conversation with them about business process recovery. And there's no ambiguity there, because we're speaking the same language. And once those recovery objectives are established, then what the business can do and IT can do together is they can build a plan and a roadmap to fill whatever gaps are identified in recovery objectives.
Well, then what actions do you recommend that CIOs and business leaders take today to be sure that their plans and procedures are in sync with the current threat environment?
Well, the first thing is to establish a program management office and a DR business continuity program. That's the first thing. The second thing is to conduct a series of stakeholder interviews with business leaders to establish what the recovery targets are for their business process. That's the second step. So now we're all speaking the same language. We've established our recovery targets. Then the third thing to do is to analyze the targets, the expectation around the targets. And I'll give you an example. You know, you might have a business person that says, I need to begin to move product again 24 hours after disaster. So there may be a gap there. IT may look at that and say, well, we can do it in 4 days. So there's a gap there. So you look at those targets, and where there's gaps, you start building a plan to remediate the gaps. And then finally, you practice. So, one of the shortfalls, that a lot of organizations do is they feel they have a DR strategy and a DR plan, but they don't practice it annually. So when you practice, you identify where your weaknesses are. You identify things that you thought you could recover in a certain amount of time that you can't recover. So establish the PMO, align with the business around business process, do a gap analysis, and conduct regular annual practices of your DR and your business continuity.
Next, we'll find out what IT and business leaders are most concerned about when it comes to a disaster. We'll also talk about the concept of codependency between recovery and continuity plans. In addition, we'll review the major challenges organizations face with their DRBC plans and procedures. So, what are the biggest worries that IT decision makers have about disasters? Well, the organization Data Barracks, an IT-hosted services firm, asked that very question and more of over 400 technology professionals in their annual Data Barracks Data Health Check. Here's how the professionals responded to a question about their biggest disaster concerns. Loss of revenue was the highest on the list, with 22% of the 400 IT pros putting it in the top slot. Customer dissatisfaction and reputational damage tied for second place with 16%. Lost productivity was next with 13% of the survey group indicating it as their biggest concern. Loss of sales opportunities came in with 7% of the tally. Regulatory penalties and employee dissatisfaction came in at 5% and 3% of the vote, respectively. And finally, 19% of the survey participants checked other reasons, none, or I don't know. When asked about their level of confidence in their recovery and continuity plans, survey participants offered the following response. 41% stated that they were very confident with their plan. 49% say they were fairly confident. 10% of the 400 IT pros in the survey group revealed that they have concerns with their firm's DRBC plan. And 1% indicated that they were not confident at all in the plan. With that data in mind, let's return to interview guest Dave Lockhart and learn more about best practices for disaster recovery and business continuity. Dave, I'm interested in the concept of codependency between disaster recovery and business continuity plans. This is something that you and your firm feel very strongly about. Please explain the concept of DRBC plan codependency for us.
Well, let's start with defining BC and DR. So business continuity is the strategy associated with recovering a location if the location becomes unavailable and restoring business in another location. That's the definition of business continuity. The definition of disaster recovery is the restoral of IT operations in another location if a disaster occurs. Where the codependency comes into play, and codependency is often thought of as a psychological term, but the reason they're codependent is because without a cohesive business continuity and DR strategy, somebody's going to be upset with the outcome. So, an example would be if my manufacturing plant in Singapore is unavailable because a utility has cut the electrical power to the facility. So the business has to conduct business somewhere else, but when they move to that other location, do they have the technical services they need to conduct business in that location? So if IT is only thinking about DR and not thinking about BC scenarios, and the business continuity leadership team is thinking only about physical recovery and not the IT services necessary that go with the physical recovery, then you don't have the recovery of the business function, which is really what we're geared for. So that's why there's a codependent relationship. And that's where, most of the gaps are today, is those two concepts, even in the biggest companies, are never thought of as one thing, and they should be thought of as one thing.
My understanding is that basing recovery targets on business process is a key part of the DRBC concept you're recommending. Is that correct?
Well, it's correct, and it's the reason for that is there's two primary reasons for it. One is, the amount of appropriate spend on recovery that spend is typically funded out of the business. So the business needs to know that the funding is appropriate. And, when we're talking about recovery objectives, the best practice recovery objectives are 1, 3, and 7 days. So when you ask the business a question about recovery, a business process, the answer is typically 1, 3, or 7 days. So it's important to be speaking the same language. Many DR plans are based not on business process recovery, they're based on recovery of an application, and our feeling it needs to be more granular than that. And what you see that's interesting when you engage with the business, on business process recovery questions, everybody ends up in the right place. So as an example, with a retailer, the CFO, who's very passionate about systems being available, will often say, well, general ledger, invoicing, accounts payable, 4 days is okay. My data reporting, 7 days is okay. And so they're very business savvy about that. And then when you look at the retailer and you look at things that are customer impacting, like moving product through the supply chain, being able to do credit authorization, website availability, they're like, those need to be 24 hours because they're directly impacting the customer. So what we find is when you get to a business process level, it really allows you to segment the strategy intelligently and align very closely with what the business really views as being the recovery objective and what's appropriate.
Now, tell us exactly, how do you make that happen? Take us through the process.
Well, the first thing you do is you create a program around this. The second thing is you make sure you've got executive sponsorship. Third thing you do is you define your business process and engage with the business stakeholders and establish recovery targets. And the fourth thing is you build a strategic roadmap to meet those recovery targets. And the fifth thing is you practice DR and business continuity recovery on an annual basis.
And practice makes perfect, correct?
Practice does make perfect, because what happens is there's a couple of reasons why you practice. One is you always find when you practice that you've missed something, and it might be something that seems trivial, but it may become important. Like, I can't print. Well, that could be a significant business function in recovery. So you practice to catch those things. The other reason you practice is everything's evolving. So you may be practicing the recovery of your financial systems. And in the years since you practiced last, maybe your CFO decided that he's outsourced an aspect of accounts payable to another location. And then you do your practice and you realize you can't get to that location. So that's why you practice, because new things are always happening, and it's important to catch those things.
Give us an idea of some of the scenarios that might drive the need for an integrated disaster recovery and business continuity plan.
There's three things that cause the need to engage in business continuity and DR. One are the first area is environmental. So there we're talking about hurricanes, snow, flooding, earthquakes. So environmental things can cause the need to engage in DR, business continuity. The second thing, which is one that people don't always think about, is human factors. So a data center or a location might be unavailable because somebody in IT does something unintentionally that causes a disruption of service. Or a human factor could be the utility company is trenching outside a manufacturing plant and they happen to cut through the fiber optic cable going into the plant. So there's human factors. And then there's, today I think, topically, we see them every day, are geopolitical factors. Things like disease, terrorism, war. These are all things today that create situations where locations become unavailable, from a business perspective.
Dave, are new global business models such as global supply chains and shared service centers creating more risk and a need for more cohesive DRBC thinking?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, they are creating more need because the environment, the business ecosystem is more complex. So you've got a producer of consumer products. That producer of consumer products probably started out viewing North America as their primary marketplace. Then it became Europe. Then it became Asia Pacific. And then it became the emerging markets of BRIC countries, the Brazils, the Turkeys, Chinas, Indias of the world. So it's more complex, because their business footprint is more geographically distributed. However, in some ways there's less risk if proper planning is being conducted, because instead of having a single place which is coordinating a single business function, you've distributed that globally. So I think there's a positive and negative to it.
Dave, what are the biggest challenges organizations are facing with their disaster recovery and business continuity plans and procedures today?
I think the biggest challenge is getting organized and building a methodology and working logically through the process. Establishing the program, getting the sponsorship, establishing the recovery targets, building a roadmap for moving forward. I think there's methodology challenges that organizations have where they could use best practices, they could use help in that area. The other, I think the fifth challenge is the one that concerns us the most, which is the unknown, which is that most organizations don't realize they have an issue. They're happy. They've got a group of people that are running business continuity who think that they're safe. And they've got a group of people running their disaster recovery office, and they believe that they've got it covered, but they're not necessarily aligning with each other, and they don't realize that they're codependent and they should be working together. I think that's the one of the challenges, is creating that awareness.
Could you share an experience that would help illustrate a successful DRBC plan at work?
One scenario that comes to mind is we were working with our manufacturing division, and I knew that we had 12 manufacturing plants around the world, and we had a key plant in Singapore, and I knew that from a DR perspective that there were human factor risks in that Singapore plant, and because I knew that Singapore plant only had one cable access into the plant. So we knew on the IT side that there was a potential that cable could get cut. So we engaged the plant manager in the conversation, and we talked about that potential, and the plant manager said, well, what would it cost to fix that? So we talked with the local service provider, and it turned out that it was a multi-million-dollar fix. And the plant manager was like, well, I can't afford that. So I'm going to live with that residual risk. So part of the conversation with BC and the conversation between IT and the business is to talk about residual risk. Because there's risk in all aspects of business. What residual risk is that's the amount of risk that the business is willing to tolerate. So you can never close the risk door all the way, but what you do is you want to close the door far enough where the risk profile is reasonable, and the amount of risk you leave on the table is residual risk. So we had the conversation with the manufacturing plant leader, and we said that, we're comfortable with that amount of residual risk. So he knew that if that cable got cut, his plant would be unavailable. Now, as time went on, we knew that we had a gap. So we knew that we wanted to close that risk profile in a more affordable way. So when we upgraded our manufacturing ERP system to a centralized model, we knew that all the formulas were coming from a centralized place. So we implemented a wireless network connection that we would bring up to allow the formulas to be distributed to the plant in the case of that cable cut. So that's an example where IT and the business were working together. They knew they had an issue. They were both saying, we're aware of this. So if a disaster had happened, the business person wouldn't have said, it's your fault, you didn't think of this. We knew we had the risk, but we were starting to close the risk in a fiscally responsible way. So that was an example, a pretty good example of what I would call the business continuity DR partnership that can occur naturally between IT and the business, so that everybody's on the same page.
Dave, please summarize the information you've shared with us today in the form of several best practices for developing and maintaining effective DRBC plans and procedures.
Well, yeah, I think the first best practice is to think about DR and BC holistically, and to make sure that the business continuity team and the DR team are sitting together and talking about business recovery in a holistic fashion. The other best practice is to think about the new world scenarios. Think about how the business model is changing and how that scenario may be a scenario that should be incorporated into a DRBC strategy. So an example, the new business model is moving from a centralized supply chain hub to a regionally distributed supply chain hub. That's a reason for the BCDR team to talk, to say, okay, well now what's our approach to BCDR there? Another scenario might be, we've got a large consumer products good company. We're building out 25 offices in every province in China. What's the BCDR approach to China? How do we move into China safely? What do we do if we lose a business office in China in one of the provinces? So I think, there's two high-level best practices there, is to make sure the BC and DR teams are talking together, and also for them to think of it from a strategic perspective. Think about how the strategy of the company is evolving, and make sure that strategy gets incorporated into the BRDC strategy. As I said before, a solid best practice also is to interview all your business stakeholders as a starting point. Just to figure out where you are now, and interview your CFO, interview your supply chain vice president, interview your merchandising leader, interview your laboratory leader, make sure you interview your manufacturing leadership, make sure that that you understand what their business processes are and that they've established targets, because they can become your partners. IT people most often get concerned that that they're not respected, and they don't have enough money to do the right thing. Well, if IT people can learn to talk the language of the business, which is business process, they're going to start to get funding, because the business will say, this person can help me.
We'll wrap up our report with a look to the future and some further advice from our expert, Dave Lockhart. In today's program, we first discussed the current state of disaster recovery and business continuity plans and preparedness in enterprises today. Next, we talked about the typical shortfalls of DRBC plans. Then, we learned why many IT professionals and security experts today consider recovery and continuity plans to be codependent. We then identified challenges organizations typically face with their plans and offered best practices for success. Next, we'll wrap up our report with a look to the future and some added advice from our expert. Dave, looking ahead 3 to 5 years, what do you think will be the most significant changes in disaster recovery and business continuity planning?
Thanks, Mike. There are a couple trends that we believe will continue. One trend that we believe will continue, which is probably obvious, which is businesses will continue to distribute globally. Businesses will continue to be trying to deliver their products and services to a global marketplace. The second trend that we think will continue is that businesses will continue to distribute functions and source. So businesses will continue to distribute their business functions globally, and they'll continue to look for sourcing opportunity to do functions within their business which are not core. So sourcing IT, sourcing financial services, sourcing HR. Businesses are very much trying to optimize their models. So sourcing, connecting to the sourcing centers will continue to be something that businesses will see. The other thing I think, we believe will continue also is cloud computing. So, the percentage of corporate applications and the associated business process is very rapidly moving towards cloud computing. Many CIOs have talked about choices where applications run, and a tagline that we've heard a number of times is cloud first. So the CIO is saying the first place we put our application is in the cloud, second place might be in the corporate data center. So we see more and more movement towards cloud computing. Not one cloud provider, but more software as a service cloud provider. The thing that is evolving. I think will change dramatically in the future, and it's more of an opportunity as well as a risk is connectivity and mobility. So we're, clearly with the iPhone, we're moving more and more towards a mobile environment. So, our belief is that wireless and mobile connectivity will continue to grow over time, and it's very important to, think of that as an opportunity. We view it as an opportunity. We think that business continuity, business recovery can be enhanced by mobility and connectivity. However, they need to be thought of holistically, and I'll give you an example of why. When you're accessing corporate applications and business process, typically you need privileges to do that. So when IT organizations tend to think of your privileges as it's a set of access rights. Generally, those access rights are defined in the corporate data center. Because I might have access rights to a product portal. I might have access rights to a Salesforce cloud. I might have access rights to a financial cloud system. But that's all going through that corporate data center to get there. So that's why we need to think of it holistically, because that mobility and that wireless access is good, but if that employee is blocked in trying to get to one of those services, then there's still a problem there.
Dave, please offer a final thought for our viewers on the topic.
My final thought is if you're in the business, make sure you're partnering with IT, and if you're in IT, partner with the business, and think of DR and BC as things that should be thought of together.
Well, Dave, thank you so much for sharing such timely and helpful information on this important topic.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it.
Well, that completes today's report. I'm Michael Quinlan, and thanks for watching.